Right. We are the Midshore Council on Family Violence. We're a domestic violence program which serves Kent, Queen Anne's, Caroline, Dorchester, and Talbot counties. So we're unique in that large geographic area. We work with victims of domestic violence all the way from crisis when they flee in the middle of the night and need a place to stay, all the way up to 2 years later when they've transitioned and they are moving on and moving out of the relationship. So Midshore Council, we have a crisis shelter, and the most common method of reaching Midshore is through our hotline. We have an 800 number. It's 1-800-927-4673. There's an advocate who answers that 24 hours a day. And then we can talk to you about your options. If you don't need a place to stay immediately, we can certainly help you with your legal needs. We have a program where we retain through a contractual relationship attorneys, local attorneys, to represent our clients in final protective order hearings and also in divorce and custody, which might take a little bit longer. So there are many reliefs available through the court system now for domestic violence victims. With a protective order, you can obtain use and possession of the family home. You can literally have the abuser out of the house, out of the situation, and you can move back into the house, which is the ideal, because then the kids can go back to school where they normally go to school. You can be in the area where you work, and the abuser has to stay away from you and not contact you. So that's a very good option and one most utilized by a lot of our clients. If they don't have a place to stay, then they can stay in our crisis shelter, and then we work with them on transitional housing, which is longer term. So Midshore has a transitional house in Centerville. It's maintained by the Centerville Rotary Club, and we can have people stay there for up to 2 years. And then we also have a grant through the U.S. Department of Justice to provide housing to clients wherever they select the housing. We can pay first month's rent or multiple months' rent and really help them get back on their feet after they leave a domestic violence relationship. All of our services are also provided in Spanish. We have a bilingual program, so we do that. And then we also work with the abusers. We run the abuser intervention program in the 5 counties, and typically abusers are court ordered. I would say 95% of them are court ordered through court proceedings, or they can volunteer. And that's a 26-week program. There are group sessions and then 6 individual sessions with the facilitator. And that's called the Abuser Intervention Program.
That's new to me. That's really wonderful. That's great.
Yeah, there's a mandate in Maryland. We receive money through the state, and if you provide services to victims, you must provide services to the abuser. So that is the only program where there's a fee attached. All the other services provided to at Midshore are free of charge, but there is a $35 intake fee and $25 a week for the Abuser Intervention Program. We, well, certainly the courts, when people wander in there and want to get a protective order, they'll refer people. We also work with the law enforcement. So if they are called to the scene, they refer people to Midshore Council. We work with the local hospitals. So if someone shows up at the emergency department with injuries, there's a screening of questions, not necessarily are you a victim, but are you afraid to go home? And would you like to talk to somebody? And so then they would contact us. Also, we have our 800 number out and about on brochures. Certainly interviews like this we appreciate in helping get the word out. I think it's very important that victims know they're not alone and that it's only going to get worse over time and it's not their fault. I think those are messages that someone who's in a relationship feels that they're the reason, they're the cause, they've done something wrong, they bought into that blame, and therefore they believe they have control. So if I stop doing this, or if I stop dressing like this, or if I stop hanging out with these friends, or if I stop working, if I do whatever they accuse me of doing, if I stop doing that, it'll change. And I've worked with victims for many years, and they told me, it could be 5 kids later or 6 months later when the light bulb goes off and says, it's not me. There's nothing more I can do to change myself, to protect myself. It's this person's behavior. And that's when they pick up the call, and they pick up the phone and make the call. But they really want to know, well, what's the next step? You're dealing too with, and I have to say this, and people, there's a love in these relationships, and usually these relationships start out with what's called a whirlwind romance. It's very intense, and because of the power and control dynamic, there's a lot of isolation of the victim. Let's spend time together and let's build a family together. And there's a lot of effort invested in keeping the victim just with that abuser. And because they don't want them to get out and talk to people who are going to give them resources to say, this is not normal, you need to call somebody. So the fear, there is love, and I think that victims always try to bring the relationship back into that loving time. And there is a cyclical nature to domestic violence. So there could be a push and a shove, and then there's, I didn't mean to do that, or I had a stressful day, or I'd been drinking. And then, then they go back into what's called the honeymoon phase. The sad thing is that repeats itself, and as it repeats itself, it gets worse over time to where it could be actually lethal. So there is fear, and it's a very legitimate fear, because leaving a domestic violence relationship is the most dangerous time. You read about it all the time, and if she wants to get a protective order, or she wants to come to shelter, or she goes and stays with the friends, when they leave and say, I've had enough, that is the most dangerous time. And it's also the most intense time usually when the abuser is trying to get them back. It'll never happen again, give me another chance. And there are chances given. On average, a victim leaves 5 to 8 times before they actually leave. And it's not uncommon for people to call our hotline months after months and then finally come in for services. So it's a process. And the laws have changed. I think that we now have what's called a warrantless arrest in Maryland. And the criminal laws have really changed so that the police can do more. They used to have to say to a victim, go, if you're beaten up, but you need to go and take out the charges. And that's a very huge step for a victim when they don't have an advocate to go with them, for example. But now, if the police see that there's an injury and they have probable cause to believe that this occurred, they can take out the charges. And there's victim advocates in the state's attorney's office so that you can help the victim along the way when she has to testify, for example. These are huge steps for a victim in the process of leaving. And that's where Midshore comes in. We have advocates throughout your journey in making these decisions and taking these steps, because it is very scary, and it can be unsafe. So we have all of those precautions in place. And I certainly recommend, if you know someone who's a victim of domestic violence who wants to leave, send them to Midshore, because you don't want to set yourself up if taking someone in and the abuser comes and, it is a dangerous time. Well, I've been in the field about 25 years, so I've seen really a trend of when domestic violence programs started. It was about the victim fleeing in the middle of the night, this crisis piece. And so you sort of had procedures and policies that you could stay in a crisis shelter for 30 days. And what I've seen now, those days are gone. You cannot, especially in rural Maryland, get back on your feet in 30 days. There's no housing available. So what we have shifted at Midshore is we are invested to helping people from that crisis all the way to 2 years later. Throughout that process, when you leave crisis and you get therapy and you take out the protective order and you get a lawyer for divorce and custody, then what's the next step? You need housing in between. You need somewhere to live for 2 years while you go back to school, or you work on getting a job and you get your kids in therapy. You need that process. And then you move on to what's the next step. So we've shifted to be just a crisis program to more being longer term and helping in all areas of your life. And that's been a very important step for victims.
That's wonderful.
Because I would say 98% of our victims come to us with zero money. Either their bank accounts are locked, or they have no money, they have no access to money. And so that's, they say, how am I going to support myself? So, our challenge is to get money and grants and support to be able to provide all those services for a longer period of time. Yeah, you see self-medicating. I think too, I also see if there's drugs and alcohol involved, it becomes an excuse. Oh, he was just drinking. And I've worked with a victim who, I went to court with her, and she had the marks around her neck, and she said to me, Jeanne, every time he beat me up before, he had been drinking. And so I really believed that it was, but this time when he tried to kill me, strangle me, he was stone cold sober. And that was what got her. She bought into that. So When we have abusers come to our abuser intervention program, they have to be clean and sober. They have to go through addictions, obviously, before they can deal with the entitlement behaviors and some of those abusive behaviors in our group. So I think the danger is to say, if you take away the alcohol, you'll take away the abuse. But I will tell you that if there's alcohol and drugs involved, it becomes those lethal cases. It becomes out of control, and it just escalates to the point of death in many cases. Call us. I mean, when you get a chance, in this day of the cell phones, if you can, keep our 800 number handy, I mean, certainly just give us a call and let's talk about a safety plan. If you stay in the home, let's talk about a safety plan. If you start being abused at home, flick on the light on the front porch so your neighbors know to call 911. There are safety plans we can put into place if you're staying and you're not ready to leave, or when you're ready to leave. And that's what we do. So it's a tough step, but I can tell you that there are hundreds of people that I've worked with, and Midshore has worked with thousands, in fact, that have made that step, and they're on their own, and they're self-sufficient, and they're in healthy relationships. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and we recognize that it's a long process and you're not going to be alone.